Good morning again, and I just want to welcome you to Long Hill Chapel. Whether you are watching online or you're here in the room, my name is Michael Hoddy. I'm the lead pastor here at Long Hill, and I'm just so glad on this second Sunday, it's hard to believe it's the second Sunday of Advent already, that you are here with us. You know, when I was a kid, we had one of those fabric Advent calendars, and like now in our house, we have one and it has the chocolate in it, and my kids just every day, they're highly motivated, let's just say, to mark off another day of Advent. But the one we had all these little Christmas ornaments in it, all these little fabric ornaments. And I still remember those ornaments to this day. We would start at the bottom of the tree and we'd go row by row by row by row until we got to the very top of the tree where the star went, and that was Christmas Eve. I still remember that so clearly because what it did is it marked for us, just like it does for any kid, the expectation that we all feel as we come closer in some ways to Christmas. But it also marked something else, which was the waiting. You know, I enjoyed that because I loved that part of Christmas, and you know what, your kids do too, and so much of Christmas is about that. It's about expectancy, or it's about expectation. It's about preparing. It's about getting ready. It's about decorating. Yesterday we were outside, and our goal as a household is to add more lights than we had last year, come what may, by whatever means. And so if I seem like I'm stepping a little bit gingerly, it's because as a dad, I'm exhausted and my back hurts like I never thought that it would. But we have more lights than we had before. We also have more lights than much, not all, that's our goal, but much of our neighborhood. And you can see our house from space. So that's the goal. That's what we love to do to celebrate Christmas. My wife Grace was making cookies last night. We ate cookies last night. I ate cookies for breakfast this morning, and I highly recommend that. But that's so much of what Christmas is about. It's all those things, but at the same time, it's about waiting. It's about the fact that we are waiting for Christmas to come. We're waiting with hope. Even those of us who are facing periods of struggle or difficulty in our lives, there's something about this season that causes us to wait with hope. We're waiting with expectation. We're waiting because something or someone is coming. But while we have this expectancy, this thing that we're looking forward to, the truth about all of us is that we really hate waiting. We don't like waiting. Think about the traffic that you've waited in. Think about if you've gone to the mall, which I highly don't recommend. This is why the internet is amazing. You should totally shop there instead. As magical as it is to go to the mall, you have to also leave the mall. And there's lines out of the parking lot. There's lines at the cash register. There's all sorts of lines, and it gets this thing inside of us where that Christmas spirit of joy, of hope, of peace, and of love goes away very quickly. You don't have a lot of joy, a lot of peace, and a lot of love for the BMW that's in front of you that just won't get out of the way. You don't have that, and neither do I, because it triggers something that's in us. It triggers the fact that our plans sometimes are frustrated. It triggers the fact that we don't have the sense of control in our lives that we wish we did, or sometimes even that we think that we do. And what gets really complicated about this tension of waiting between expectancy and frustration, is when it comes to God. You know, most of us, if you're a follower of Jesus, if you're here at this church, if you're watching online, at some level you have this idea that God can do things, even that God can do big things. And so we have this expectancy that God gets the last word, that God can show up in our circumstances, that God can provide for us, but at the same time, so many of us are found waiting. We're found waiting, and we're trying to hold on to expectancy, but we also struggle, if you're anything like me, with frustration. Because we look at God, we continue to pray, but in the back of our minds, there's this thing that says, you know, I thought he promised. I thought he said he'd do this. I thought things would be different by now. And so we're all waiting for something. We're waiting for clarity. We're waiting for healing. We're waiting for provision. We're waiting for a relationship that's broken to mend. We're waiting for doors to open. We're waiting for kids to come home. We're waiting for our marriage to turn around, for prayers to break through. We don't hate the waiting so much because it's long. We hate it because we can't see how or when it all works out. And so there's this tension that we feel, this tension between expectancy and frustration when it comes to waiting. And there's this reflex that begins to kick in as well. And it's something like this, God isn't moving fast enough. Maybe he's busy, maybe he's tired, maybe he needs a little bit of help. How many of you honestly you've helped God out a little bit? I do this all the time. I should know better, but I'm like, God, I can help you out here. I know you've got a lot going on. You're all over the world. You're the God of the universe. And down here, it seems like maybe you've just missed it, or you've lost the paperwork, or you've forgotten. And so I'm here to help you out just a little bit. And what happens underneath that is we're wondering if God is actually in control. We're wondering if he actually sees us. And our expectancy begins to turn to frustration. And if we struggle with God without understanding how God works in the waiting, we begin to miss God. We begin to misunderstand what's happening in our lives and in our circumstances. And we begin to go down this path of cynicism and even doubt, or even worse. And today what I want to talk about is the fact the problem is not that God is slow. It's that very often we rush. Very often we rush. And it's not without the best of intentions that we do this, but we see that things, that circumstances, that all that is in our life should happen on a different timeline than what we experience. And I want you to hear this morning, because some of you struggle with this, and you struggle with it, and you're before God, and you're in that tension of expectancy and frustration, and it feels like the needle's moving just a little more towards frustration. The people of God have always lived in this tension. They've lived in the tension of, you said you would, so where are you in this? You, friend, are not alone. Do not let the enemy of your soul, do not let Satan try to convince you that you're alone in this, because this is something that humanity has always felt when it comes to God. And the good news of all of this is not so much that we're faithful in our waiting. I'm not. You probably aren't either. But that God is faithful in his coming. We're not faithful very often in our waiting, but God is always faithful in his coming. And today we're going to read a story that doesn't seem like a Christmas story, but it connects to the Christmas story. It's a story about this tension this morning from an unexpected place, from the Old Testament book of Genesis, chapter 12. And I think as we absorb this, as we reflect on this, we'll begin to see a new reality of how God works in the waiting. And so I'd ask Bruce Fiddler, who's one of our elders, to come this morning and to read the scriptures from Genesis chapter 12.
Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Hear the word of the Lord. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord.
And so we have a story, and this is kind of one of those Bible stories. I grew up in a time, and some of you who are younger are totally not going to relate to this, but it wouldn't be the first time, where it was before TVs. In all our classrooms downstairs, we have video screens, and we have video curriculum, and we just have all these resources available to us. We had these things called flannel graphs in our classrooms, and some of you are just like, what does that mean? It's this board that's made of flannel, and you have all these characters that you kind of place into different scenes. They're also made of flannel. And this was one of those stories that was a flannel graph story. You'd have this little character made out of flannel of Abraham, and maybe you'd have a donkey or you'd have some other thing. And when the story comes that Abraham left his home, he left this place called Haran, and he goes to this new place that the Lord calls him. He says, "Go to a land that I'll show you." And so flannel Abraham would go from this side of the board to this side of the board. He'd go about a grand total of about 18 inches. And that's how sometimes we perceive this kind of a story. But let's look a little bit back behind the curtain with this. Abraham in Haran with his family, with his livestock, one of the things we learn about him is he's a wealthy, established person. Just like in this area, there are many wealthy, established people. This is who Abraham is. He's there with many of the generations of his family, and things are pretty flush. He has wealth, he has flocks, he has land, he has servants. And he's married to a woman named Sarai, who will later become Sarah. And we learn as we go through the narrative that he and Sarai have no children. And in this time and in this place, to not have an heir, to have no children, was looked at as a serious deficiency. And to cap it off, to complicate things even further, Abraham and Sarah are both very old. They're in their 70s. Sarah is in her 60s. And there's this call that God gives to Abraham. He says, "Get up, go from the place where you have the flocks and the wealth and the servants and the land and the livestock and your family, and go to this place that I'm going to show you." This does not seem like a great relocation strategy. It's like, take this good situation you have, leave that, and go to a destination that is uncertain. And so God, this God called Yahweh in the Old Testament, is asking Abraham to abandon everything he knows for a promise, but for an unseen promise. And speaking of God, it's easy to say, well, that's God, and God spoke out of the heavens, and Abraham was like, hey, it's God. Abraham was in this land of Canaan, and he would have not recognized the God that becomes the God that we worship and the God that the ancient people of Israel worshiped. Because at that time, polytheism, multiple gods, multiple deities, that ruled the land. And so this unknown God kind of comes out of nowhere and asks Abraham to do this audacious, difficult thing. And this isn't like moving to a new state. This isn't like, you know what, I'm sick of the taxes in New Jersey, I'm going to move to North Carolina. I'm going to move out to Pennsylvania. This is like moving to a new country where the terrain, where the people, where the language are completely foreign. But the thing that God does is he makes a promise to Abraham and to Sarah, which must have gotten to their hearts, to the thing that they felt that reminded them of the ache, of the frustration, of the expectancy, of having their hopes dashed. Because God promises to these old, barren people an heir. He says, you're not only going to be fruitful, but your descendants are going to scatter and they're going to spread throughout the entire earth. And the thing that's crazy about this story is Abraham actually does the thing. He gets up and he goes, and he's driven, I believe, by his expectancy. But then the payoff doesn't happen yet. You know what? I have preached sermons, and many pastors and preachers have preached sermons about, you know what? You need to take a big step of faith. And Abraham took a big step of faith. And if you'll just take a big step of faith, you'll see God. What happens is Abraham takes this big step of faith, going from the known, going from the wealthy, going from his family, going this distant journey to an unknown land. And it's not like the heir and the promise and the payoff meet him there. The angels don't start singing. He makes the move. And I believe he makes the move to nothing. He makes the move to a season that begins of waiting. The waiting begins not at the beginning of the journey, but after the step of faith. And I think sometimes you and I, we think the hardest part of following God is the going. It's the step, it's the big thing, it's the decision, it's the leap, it's the moment. But very often it takes more faith to wait than it does to go. It takes more faith to wait than it does to go. We have a faith, and we have worship songs, and we have sermons, and we have all these things that are about, you need to step out in faith, and you know what, friends, you do. But a lot of times when we step out in faith, but then at the end of that step, we don't find the promise, we find more waiting. And I think if we don't understand how God works, this is one of the most disillusioning things that we do, because we look up at the sky and we say, God, I followed you. I thought I heard you. I thought I knew what you'd asked me to do. And I took the step, and here I am by myself with my thoughts, without anything that looks like what made it worth it. Going, when we take the step, this is why this is hard, especially for us. It gives us something to do. Sometimes in life, I'm just like, I just need to know what I need to do. How many of you have had a season of that? You're looking at the future, you're looking at your relationship, you're looking, at your career, and you're saying, God, it would just be great if you told me exactly what I need to do, and then I'll go do the thing that you told me I need to do. Going gives us something to do, but waiting only gives us God. It actually gives us nothing but God. When God says go, even though it's scary, even though there's fear and trepidation around it, there's also this excitement, there's this expectation, because you get to pack, you plan, you move, you participate. But when God says wait, there's no checklist, there's no timeline, there's just the promise, and sometimes there's silence. Going feels heroic. Waiting feels helpless. And that needle begins to move from expectancy to frustration. Now, as Abraham and Sarah have made this move, they've made the jump, they've made the leap, they've done the thing, the years begin to pass. The clock continues to tick, and I can only imagine that they looked at themselves and they realized that they were old to begin with, but that they were only getting older, that this promise that God had given didn't feel like it was getting closer. It felt like it was getting farther away. And the years and even the decades go by. And there's places in this story of Abraham in Genesis where Abraham begins to let his frustration run ahead of his expectation. He takes matters into his own hands. He tries to help God out because it seems like God needs some help. It seems like God said the thing, made the call, gave the promise, and then kind of forgot to do anything after that. You and I, as I said, we do this all the time, and the reason we help God out is it gets us out of that waiting thing, and it gets us back into something that we can do. Going, it tests your willingness. It's God coming before you and saying, are you willing to take this step of faith. But waiting tests something else. Waiting tests your heart. I believe it takes actually more faith to stay in the tension, to keep praying, to be still, to keep hoping when nothing seems to change. But there's a development that's happening here. It's happening in us when we wait, and it's this. Before God fulfills a promise, he forms a person. Before God fulfills a promise, he forms a person. And just to give you the back end of this story, after 25 years, Abraham and Sarah have a son whose name is Isaac. But in that middle period, I can imagine, and maybe you can too, because you find yourself in something that feels like this. You've taken the step. You've taken a step into faith. You've taken a step that's audacious. You've gotten over your fears. You've mustered up enough courage, and you've taken the step, and you're in the season right now where it feels like you're waiting, and frustration is beginning to build. You know, I had this story in my life. It's 17 years ago that this happened. And I had in my mind this idea that God was calling me to this big public thing. You know, I got a bunch of people together and I was just, I was pontificating. Can you imagine me pontificating? Saying a lot of stuff. You guys have to put up with this every week when I do this. But it's just going on and on about how it's going to be this great thing that God was going to do, and he was going to use us, and it was going to be awesome. And there's this older guy in the front row who I began to get to know. He was a former machinist, salt of the earth kind of guy. He was retired, and he was just kind of looking at me. And kind of somewhere in there, and I promise you this is true, he looked at me, and he said, "What are you trying to prove? What are you trying to prove?" And it wasn't hostile. It was wise. It wasn't hostile. It was wise because he had seen a lot more of life than I had. He'd even seen a lot more of God than I had. And he knew that I was trying to do the thing not only for God, but to help God out as I did it. And so instead of going and doing that thing, I entered this period. It was about a 6-year period of waiting. And I still got to take the step, but it was much later on. And as I look back at my life, if I had taken that step, that grand step, that big thing for God, and I had done it at that time, the results, not only for me, but actually for the people around me, would have been absolutely disastrous. Instead of a good thing that brought life, it would have been a bad thing that did anything but. At the time, it seemed like frustration. But in God's picture of things, and now as I look back, and isn't it amazing the hindsight we have with so many things in our lives when we look back, I realize what God was doing. He still fulfilled the promise, but in the midst of that time, he was forming the person. And so you're all going to hate this. I hate it too. We hate waiting, but God intentionally makes us do it. And he does it on purpose. And I want you to get this. This is really important. This ties the whole thing together. What God does in us as we wait is as important as the thing that we're waiting for. And as I say a statement like that, I can kind of hear what's in some of your heads. You're like, you don't know what I'm waiting for. It's really important. I don't want to be sitting here, and I'm sure God's doing something great, but that thing is more important. Can you for a second attempt to have the faith that God is still at work in your life? You may not see it. You may not understand it. You may not even like what he's doing. But he's still at work. And the reason that God does this is because there's something that develops in us that does not develop any other way. It doesn't grow any other way. There's other places in the scriptures where other writers, like the Apostle Paul, he says, you know what, when we suffer, we actually can rejoice because we know that there's something that's being produced that doesn't get produced any other way. Suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces hope, and hope does not disappoint. The kind of hope that is not dependent on circumstances, depending on the right Christmas experiences, dependent on getting the right gifts, depending on the right people to show up at the table on December 24th. It's the kind of hope that the world cannot give and the world cannot take away. When we wait, there's this space in which something can grow. What's growing as you wait? What's growing in your heart as you wait for the promise? Is it doubt? Is it cynicism? Is it bitterness? Or is it something better? Endurance, faith, hope, joy, peace, love. The very things that we center ourselves around at this time of year. And so for Abraham, the waiting continues for 25 years, but finally it pays off. And the promise is fulfilled. But remember what God said. He said, you're not just going to have a son, you're going to have a nation. And that nation is going to, all of the peoples of the earth are going to be blessed through you. And so as he rejoices in what God had done, there had to be this little thing in the back of his mind that said, this is great, but all those other things that God said, I still haven't seen those yet. Because what happens with waiting is it doesn't just stretch across Abraham's life. It stretches far beyond that. There's still more waiting, even after we start to see the promise. And this particular one stretches across the generations. God's original promise, it wasn't just about this man. It wasn't just about his family. It just wasn't about political or physical greatness. It was about becoming a people through whom God would bring blessings to all of humanity. And where does this promise actually get fulfilled? Where does it get fulfilled? Matthew, the writer of the gospel, he begins to lay out a genealogy in chapter 1 of Matthew, the gospel. And if you were writing a book, you wouldn't start with a genealogy. You would start with something good. You start with the hook. Instead, Matthew starts out with this person begat this person and this person begat that one, and your attention starts to wander and you're like, man, I could go read something better than this. But the passage starts like this, and I want you to see this. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, and who? The son of Abraham. Because in the lineage of Jesus, the one that we come to and we celebrate at Christmas, back in that lineage is Abraham. And at the end of the genealogy, and I will spare you today by not reading the whole thing. It says this in verse 17. It says, thus were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. That's a long time. That's generation after generation after generation after generation. And in the midst of this story, there's some really high points where it seems like it's going in the right direction. And there's some really low points where everybody had to be looking around just like you do and just like I do and say, where is God in the midst of these circumstances? But the truth that we see here is even in the waiting, God still keeps his promises. And friends, he is keeping and will keep his promise to you. And you may see part of it in your life, but there's a part that goes beyond your life that's in your legacy that you may never see. Your waiting may produce someone. It may not be something you get. It may be someone you raise. It may not be something you experience in the moment and achieve and accomplish and acquire. It may be something you leave behind or someone who has an impact you cannot even begin to imagine. And Abraham here, He got part of the promise, but he doesn't know this connection. Some of you can't see the connection to God's promises in your life and how they are the slow work of salvation in your life. And you know what? That's okay. It's not tremendously satisfying, but it's okay. Obey anyway and wait anyway. Because from Abraham to this time that we celebrate, the birth of Jesus, there were centuries of waiting. And in the midst of those centuries, there were time that seemed like silence. But you know what the good news of this season Advent is? It tells us that slow is not the same as absent. Slow is not the same as absent. Just because at times God seems like he's silent, it doesn't mean that God is absent. Christmas is the proof that God always keeps his promises, even when the waiting is long. And so how do we wait well? How do we wait well? How do we keep the needle from moving away from expectancy and all the way towards frustration? How do we wait in a way where we're not just running down the clock? And I think it's in this. It's how we view waiting. It's how we view the waiting. Is it an obstacle to us? Is it something that we need to get past? Is it some traffic in our lives, so to speak, that we need to figure out a way to get around? Or is it an opportunity to receive something we may not know that we needed? We may only see the value of and the purpose of when we look backwards. To trust that God is always at work, even when it doesn't look like what we expected, and even sometimes when we can't see it. Waiting well is faith that not only does the promise we're waiting for still mean something, because it does, but there's something much bigger that's still going on. And if we get this understanding of what waiting is about, if we're able to keep our trust and our focus on God, even in the midst of the times where we're tempted to be pulled hard in the direction of frustrating, waiting can either sap our will or it can heighten our expectancy. You know, you've waited in frustrating places. You've waited in line. You know, you've waited for all sorts of things. But then there's those waitings, they're expectant waitings. It's when someone comes home. It's when you get to see the relatives and the family again that you've waited all year to do. We did that at Thanksgiving. That's just one of my favorite things, is to walk in that door for the first time and see the people I haven't seen in months and to embrace them. And so I think it's perfectly acceptable in this long span of waiting to express your frustration. I think it's actually possible to allow your frustration to be an act of worship. You know, we come here and we sing songs, but the good news about our God is he's not just looking for our best. You know, he's not just looking for us to pump his tires by saying the right words. He actually allows us, as an act of worship, to lay down our frustration, to lay down our pain, to lay down our struggles before him and to say, God, I don't know what's going on. I hope you see what's going on. But as I do this in faith, I lay this before you and I say, God, here I am again with the good, with the bad, and with the ugly. And I trust that what you're doing takes this all into account, and I release it back to you again. And as you do that, I pray that you would ask him to turn your heart towards expectancy once again. Not just the faith of going, but the faith of waiting, like Abraham. You know, one of my favorite Christmas carols, and man, I love Christmas carols. You know, in my house, I'll just go to the piano. I have an organ there too, because of course I do. And I'll just play Christmas carols just for me, just because I love it so much. But there's a line in a little town of Bethlehem, and I think it's so appropriate for where we find ourselves here in this room, but where the world finds itself. And it goes like this. It says, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in the God of the waiting. The hopes and fears of your life, the prayers that feel like they're bouncing off the ceiling of this world and never making it to heaven. The things where you look back and you don't see what God's up to. The things you're experiencing now and you're just not sure how God's going to work it out. The hopes and the fears are met still in Him. And so this Christmas, may God meet you as you hold on to your waiting, as you hold on still to the promise that God chooses to engage with the humanity that's broken. He chooses to wait with the humanity, and He chooses that for our betterment, for what He's doing in us. And so He waits, and we wait anyway. Would you pray with me? God, we're a people who wait. We've seen your faithfulness in our lives. We've seen where you've called us to step out. But even as much we can see and we can feel, and even our heart aches for the places where we're still waiting, where we're still wondering, where we're still hoping, where we're still praying, where sometimes we feel that pull in the direction of frustration or even doubt. I pray this morning, in this moment, you'd reset our hearts. You'd pull us back in the direction of expectation. We would know your presence. That even as much as you are the God of the moving, you are the God of the waiting. And you wait with us. We pray in Jesus' name.